Over. All right, we're back on after about 18 minutes of technical difficulties. We're back on the Mike and Brooker show. I have here two guests, Rolf Ohman and Will Ratelle. Will, tell us about yourself for people that don't know who you are.
Yeah, so currently an assistant strength and conditioning coach in the college sector at University of North Dakota. That's like my salary job, and then I do some online content too, where I sell my ebooks. I just post on Instagram and YouTube some takes that I have on training, and that's what I do.
So for those of you who don't know, Will is 5'10" and fucking dunks. Like he's my height and he just slams it down and he's fucking jacked too. How much are you deadlifting right now?
Good question. I hit 605 for 8 a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Buddy's fucking strong.
I think my best is 715, but that was like 3 years ago. I probably couldn't pull 715 right now.
Yeah, shit.
Yeah.
Brooker, I don't even know what my fucking best is. I think I might be in the 650 best case. That never fucking. What do you weigh?
Like 227.
Nice fucking house. So, how old are you now?
31. I'm getting old now.
And yeah, how long have you been doing strength conditioning stuff, working in the industry?
Yeah, since 2018. So that's 6 years ago. So since I was 25, I guess.
Okay.
But I was so like stupid and naive when I first started, just like most people were. It took like 3 to 4 years to start developing my own ability of critical thinking and like coming up with my own ideas on things. So yeah.
Right on. Brooker, you're muted. What did you say?
Were you an athlete yourself before you started coaching?
Yeah. So I actually I played here at University of North Dakota. I played football, and then I had a really like short-lived on and off career playing football. So I signed with the Atlanta Falcons in 2016, the third day of the draft. I thought I was going to get drafted. I didn't. So I signed with Atlanta that third day. They cut me after the fourth preseason game of the 2016 season, and I signed a futures reserves contract with Kansas City. They cut me after OTAs or during OTAs, and then I spent 1 year up in Canada playing for the Rough Riders. Yeah.
Yeah, the journeyman.
Yep.
So
yeah.
So for the people that that follow you that don't know anything about us or Rolf, who are you? Tell us about you real quick.
Oh God. Well, first of all, compared to you lot, I'm a fossil. So that says about all. Originally from Brisbane, Australia, been living in Europe now for 28 years. Currently in the process of moving back. Assistant head coach of China in between and Olympic preparation coach for the Chinese team between 2016 and 21, 22, 23, head coach of the Hong Kong Sports Institute for sprints and jumps. And at the moment, I'm freelancing, doing education, yada, yada, yada. Have Australia's fastest 100-meter guy at the moment, who just qualified for Paris. I work in a team with another coach that I've been mentoring, and between us, we've got 3 Olympians. We've got a guy running 44.7 for the quarter. We've got a girl running 11.19 who's part of the Australian women's 4x1 team that's qualified for Paris. And yeah, I'm the inventor of the 1080. I'm the inventor of the 1080 technology. Yeah.
And you're about to open up your own facility in Australia?
Yeah, well, that is the plan.
Did you say you're the inventor of the 1080?
Yes.
Did I hear that right?
Yes. I don't work with the company. Long story short, there's an investment group that came in 2014, and we don't get on. They have no background in high performance sports. They don't listen to me. They don't listen to anybody. They know best. And I opted when Randy turned up and said, shove them and come over to China with me, because Randy was the head coach of China. So I packed my bags and went to China.
Oh,
Yeah.
so I'm laughing. I've heard this rant so many friggin' times. So anyone that
rant, what's rant business? Get your priorities right, there. Jesus. If you got that beard growing in your ears, you can't hear anymore.
So Will's by the way, Will does a ton of Olympic lifting stuff. You have a ebook, Olympic lifting ebook.
Yep.
Yeah, what is it, like Olympic lifting 101 type thing?
The way I would kind of summarize it is it's a justification for why Olympic lifts are a good tool to use in a training program outside of someone who wants to be like a competitive weightlifter, like for a team sport athlete.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the best way I could summarize it.
Gotcha. So tell us now. I've been down the rabbit hole of Olympic lifting, not Olympic lifting, Olympic lifting, not Olympic lifting for back and forth so many times. And for me, what are you, when you're applying the Olympic lifts, what is it that you are looking to do? What is it, why are they so appealing to you?
Yeah. I always try to get out of the framework of like power production, triple extension, rate of force development. I think those arguments are really poor. We can get into why I think there's a poor arguments to justify Olympic lifts, but I'm looking at the Olympic lifts as a tool to create propulsion onto an external body of mass in order to move that in this like three-dimensional setting. Create propulsion on an external body of mass, only to have to yield that body of mass within milliseconds after you create propulsion on it. So that'd be like the number one priority or like the highest value that they provide. And there's just like a lot of, I'd say like non-quantifiable value that they provide outside of things you could measure on a force plate.
Like what? What do you mean?
For example, ability to train the elastic qualities of the lower body in deep ranges of motion. So like when you catch a clean, you rapidly drop under the bar. You're in this deep hip flexion, deep knee flexion, and you rapidly try to bounce out of the bottom. I don't know if there's a better way of training that specific ability other than the Olympic lifts. I mean, there's obviously you can do like deep tier plyos, deep range plyos, things like that, but you don't get the same amount of load. It's just different,
Rolf, what do you think about that?
Well, basically, I agree. The only problem is when you're dealing with guys that are trying to run 980 or faster, unfortunately, Olympic lifting doesn't work. It's simply too slow. There's just not enough. If we look at what we found out probably 20 years ago, Randy and myself, is that the metric that has the biggest correlation for us is the acceleration index. In other words, time to peak velocity. So we need to be able to accelerate. And the problem with Olympic lifting or any exercise really is that it's too slow. So we can look at things on force plates and with the 1080 and other equipment, we get a lot of data. And it's not uncommon that we are looking at time frames of 250 to 350, 400 milliseconds. And that's fairly fast. But you got to remember, we've got these guys that we've got, they are in the ground 75 milliseconds. So we've got to be able to make things happen. So we've got to be able to load the spring and unload the spring in 75 milliseconds or faster, because we're always trying to go faster. And that is the dilemma that we've got. So it's like Randy says, Olympic lifting for us is virtually, once we get guys running sort of 10-10 in that time frame, or then they are able to get a maximum velocity of somewhere in the 11.5. You get exceptions like the kid I've got in Australia, Jacob. Jacob has a top end speed which is getting close to 12 meters per second, which is very uncommon when you haven't cracked 10 seconds. So he's got a poor acceleration. It's not because he's weak. It's just that he's been taught wrong from the beginning. We know now through a lot of research that it's not how strong you are, it's how you apply it that gets you out of the blocks and gets you down the track for the first 30 meters, and then the transition and into max velocity. So it's a matter of how you apply. So what we've found is that if we look at the acceleration part of the equation and the velocity part, and especially for us in the eccentric, which is what Randy and I have been doing a lot of work the last 15 odd years, is that we see that we get the biggest adaptations when we increase velocity in the eccentric phase. And we can only do that with help of technology. You can't get the speeds that we need with a normal bar because you have gravity. And even though you try to go down faster, most people don't drop fast enough. It's still too slow. So we need systems that can, in like the 1080 sprint, where we can get overspeed and assisted speed in this case in the eccentric phase, and that way we can speed things up like we do with, for example, the Kaiser system, when we use the rack, when we use air mass technology or air mass combo, where the more air we add to, let's say, a 300-pound weight, once we get up to about 50-50, so we've got 150 air and 150 mass, things start really, really hotting up because air is faster than gravity. So that 300 will behave very, very differently than 300 of just mass alone.
So let me ask you, what speeds eccentrically, obviously faster than 9.8 meters per second, right? So like what speeds eccentrically are you looking for?
Well, it's not so much the velocity itself. It's the rate of acceleration rather.
Mm-hmm.
And
are you looking at velocity? Are you looking at the speed of center of mass?
No, we just look at bar speed. That's how we've measured all the time. We used to look at force plates, but force plates you just get so much other zippity doo that doesn't make sense. And we just opted out of it. I mean, I've got a force plate here somewhere. I haven't used it for 10 years.
So you're trying to achieve an eccentric velocity of the bar faster than 9.8 meters per second squared, correct?
Yeah.
Is that my understanding that?
Yeah. So what Randy and I have worked with, we've worked under the assumption that there is something that's going on in the eccentric phase that doesn't make sense to the normal literature. And Professor John Cronin and Professor Sato have now shown that what we've been saying all along is what's happening. So myosin and actin, when you do two things, there's two triggers. It's either lots of mass or velocity. They trigger this response, and it's now called the filament winding theory. So what happens is that myosin and actin, they lock each other, and they don't move independently against each other, which they normally do. They lock each other into an isometric state. And then there's a protein called titin, which then acts as a bungee cord and allows myosin and actin to move together. And that then creates this situation where you can rapidly store massive amounts of elastic energy. Now, both Randy and I think this is a primeval function that we have since we virtually started walking as a species. It's there to protect the muscle from breaking. So when you are for example, when you jump out of a tree or whatever, that's why we are stronger eccentrically. But it's not enough to be strong eccentrically, because you jump out of a tree and you've got to deaccelerate. You've got to be able to store that energy and then release it. And therefore, this theory of what is now known as the filament winding theory has been the basis of how we do things. Because what we've seen is that every once in a while you get kids who they pop up and you start working with them and they do things eccentrically that nobody else is doing. And you just wonder what the hell's going on. And then when we measure them and look at what they do eccentrically, they are completely, they just obliterate everybody. So they have a genetic predisposition to be able to store and release energy very, very quickly.
So let me interrupt real quick. Will, you had said faster than 9.8 meters per second, right? So I mean, to simplify it, let's say that you end up going every 10th of a second is 0.98 meters per second every 10th of a second, and then it compounds on itself, right? Just for simplification purposes. The drop under an Olympic lift, Rolf, what's the drop under the Olympic lift? How fast is that? About 1.8 meters per second?
Yeah, I think
right?
about 1.6 is usually what we sort of
1.6.
That's the speed of the bar.
Yeah, for let's
dropping.
say the 10th of a second, right? Because that's the time in between, the pull and the catch. Let's say it's 500ths of a second, right?
Yeah, I have no idea what that number would be.
Yeah. So realistically, it's the eccentric speed at which you're catching, would only be half a meter to a meter per second, comparatively, and the time to peak velocity in that case would be what, 500 milliseconds, maybe 400 milliseconds. And comparatively, for ground contact times for top speed, that's 5x elite sprinters, right? Yeah. So Rolf, my question is, you said without the use of technology, and I assume bands fall into that category of technology of accelerating the eccentric. What we do, what I've done, because I'm trying to ball on a budget. I hook the bands, the jump stretch bands, up to my belt squat.
Yep. And
my belt squat, you've seen the videos of me doing it. We do a rapid eccentric, and then we fire the fuck up. Now, Will, what's really, really interesting that I've noticed with this is, I have guys that some of them are cock strong. And they're squatting well over 2.5 times body weight. And their eccentric, their ability to reverse speed from an accelerated eccentric and come on up. And we measure the eccentric, it's only 1 meter per second. Their concentric force, because the force output is essentially that V. So that V right there, it either teeters this way or it teeters this way. So if we slow the eccentric, it's just a faster concentric. But if we speed up the eccentric, then it's a slower concentric. And it takes like a lot of time, exposure that I've noticed anyway, exposure to that eccentric speed in order to tighten that V. Right? Does that make sense?
That's why we came up with the EA index, the elastic acceleration index, which is peak velocity divided by time to peak velocity. So it shows what you can do with acceleration and with peak velocity and as far as acceleration in the concentric phase. So usually what happens, for example, the athletes that you can usually see this with is those that have been grinding away, pro hockey players, which I worked with in Sweden for many years. They have very low EA index when you start working with them. They're sort of in the 4 or 5 range. And then it doesn't take more than 3 months, and they're up to sort of 8, 9, 10, which is fairly common.
Three months? What level? You said these are pro hockey guys or college?
No, pro hockey.
Yeah. So they're fully developed. And what are their? Because I know Randy likes getting the squat up. What are their max squats like when you initially get them in the first 3 month period?
Well, Skellefteå Hockey, who won the Swedish Championships this year, it's the 8th or 9th time they're in the final in the last 12 years. So they dominate Swedish hockey. Most of the guys there's a couple of guys that are young, but of the older crew that's been around for a while, they all squat sort of 400 pounds and up.
Yeah, and
which is
they weigh about 200 pounds or so, maybe less, right?
yeah, they're a little bit lighter. Sort of 190 to 210 is usually fairly common. And what we saw in the beginning, which is very, typical what we see also when Brandy and I got to China, is that, they're all strong, but nothing happens. It's like, there's just nothing. They do things very slow, eccentrically. I mean, we did a lot of testing. I don't know, was it 2012? We tested a powerlifter who was I think he was world record holder at one stage in the bench press. So he's doing like a 370 kilo bench press, and we compared him to an Olympic finalist in the discus who was doing about a 210 kilo. And then we started at 20 kilos and increased by 20 kilos up until they couldn't do anymore. And they had to do, I think it was 2 reps, or at the end that they were only doing singles anyway. But what was interesting to see is that even at sort of 30% of his max for the powerlifter, which was virtually 120 kilos, the velocity he could muster when he's trying to lift this as fast as possible was just ridiculously low. So you become good at what you do. I mean, he is, what Randy calls a diesel truck. In this case, it's more a hydraulic jack, human hydraulic jack. I mean, it's just a time under tension. That's what they do. That's what they excel at. But as far as power, real power that we can use, no, nothing happens. So even at the when the powerlifter was maxing out at about 210, he was still moving that faster than what the powerlifter was doing at 210, and then the 210 for him was like 70% or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So
practice. You got to practice moving fast. Well, what do you think about that?
So what are you trying to achieve with the training? Are you trying to replicate certain velocities and ground contact times in training that you would see sprinting?
No,
because I feel like that's not like a good pursuit of training.
Well, both yes and no. The problem we have is that if what we do in the gym is too far away from what we actually have to do on the track, we can't get any transfer. There's just too much of a gap, and we call that gaposis. So what we've got to do
you're trying to achieve some sort of dynamic correspondence. Is that fair?
We have to. I mean, the training has two facets. One is we want to stay healthy, so we don't want to have injuries. But at the same time, we need to do things on the track that we need to get stronger. We need to get more explosive. We've got to be able to store and release energy faster. And simply by doing this, for example, like the Russians have done with plyometrics, we've been down that rabbit hole. We've tried that, and it doesn't work with sprinters because sprinters are moving their limbs so fast. So what happens is you just wreck. That's why for example, we don't do Nordic hamstrings. Because they just kill your hamstrings. We can't recover from doing Nordics because these guys are moving that fast when we're running that if we incorporate Nordics into the program, it just wreaks havoc with their hamstrings. So we have other ways of getting around that.
So you want to get stronger, faster, reduce ground contact times, more powerful. These are like probably the 4 top qualities that you want to achieve, right?
Yeah. So what we do with that is that we do a lot of partials, and a lot of things. What happens usually when you talk to people about partials, they'll say, "Okay, so what do you mean?" Well, for us, the progression is, let's say if we look at, cleans, for example, we'll start cleans from the floor, hang cleans, drop hang cleans, and then we'll go to hang snatches and drop hang snatches with lighter weights, because they're simply faster. With squats,
but it's still not even close to the speed that you're going to see on the track. No,
but we get pretty quick TPV time. So we're down to about 140, 150, which is
so time to peak velocity would be the number one metric you're looking to achieve with training in the weight room that's going to have some sort of dynamic correspondence to the track.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, peak velocity is one. I mean, for example, Randy usually says, you'll hear him on his podcast, he'll say that we don't allow loading, for example, in cleans or clean pulls. We don't allow loading that will reduce velocity, peak velocity, to under 2 meters per second. It's just,
so why is that the metric you value? Why is time to peak velocity the metric you value? Or why do you value that? Why do you value that more than like the global stimulus that's being placed on the organism?
Because it simply doesn't give us enough adaptation. And the way we look at it is that power is force times velocity, and force is mass times acceleration. And that is that little a there in the force equation. He's the guy he is the king of metrics. If that guy doesn't move for us, it's completely useless. So if we don't take into account the two parts, we can't leave force out of the equation, but we can't leave velocity out of the equation. So we've got to sort of balance this. But what we see is, if we favor, which we've done, the force side of things, we run into a brick wall. We simply can't transfer it. One of the reasons is what we know is that with higher velocities comes a coordination effect, what is known as intramuscular coordination. So the higher the velocities you're doing things, which is what we do, for example, with the 1080 sprint. Now, instead of a lot of people who don't understand how to use a sprint, if they're going to do, for example, overspeed, they'll pull people at crazy speeds. Like, say, for example, somebody's running their maximum unassisted with any by themselves is, let's say, 10 meters per second. Now, how fast do you run this guy? Well, first of all, what you've got to do then is you've got to do a few trials where you then see, for example, where is his elastic threshold? Because if he can't reposition fast enough, then he's just going to break. So what the first thing we've got to be able to do is ascertain what is his elastic threshold. Now, there are athletes, for example, Christian Taylor, who's won 3 Olympics and 5
What is
World
elastic threshold, though?
What's that?
What is elastic threshold? How do you determine what that is? And then is there a different threshold for various tissues in the body?
Yeah, well, so we do that by looking at, because when you pull somebody and they are positive, in other words, they can reposition, there is a constant amount of force being generated, because you are braking. Everybody brakes. Once that force starts to increase over a certain limit, which we've ascertained by the use of lasers, we then know that, okay, now the force all of a sudden is, let's say, it's 50 Newton. Now, 50 Newton is too high. So that, therefore, we now know that this guy, he's getting caught a little bit too early. So in other words, we're going to have to back off. So we back off, let's say we backed off to 10.4 meters per second. Then all of a sudden his Newton meters, they go back down to about 35, which means that's the sweet spot. So that means that's how quick he can reposition. So if we try to pull him faster, nothing's going to happen. We're just going to we're virtually going to yank him over the support position in sprint, and therefore we're not doing anything to him. In fact, we're destroying all his feeling for the ground, because running fast is also it's a utilization of the ground reaction force. So you've got to be able to wait but you don't wait, but you do in fact have to feel what's happening with the ground. So if you sort of just rip your feet off the ground and try to slam them into the ground, that doesn't work. You can get away with that if you're running 1050, 1070, 1080, but you cannot do that if you're running 980, 970, 960. Doesn't work. Forget it. These guys are moving it like I said, Sue, for example, who's got the fastest 60 of all time, a 983, he's got a ground contact time of 74 milliseconds. So what we then do is we look at the exercises that we do, and we progress from, let's say, a parallel squat to a quarter squat to a box squat, and therefore what happens is the time to peak velocity it decreases because we're in a better position biomechanically, and we can accelerate faster. So the time to peak velocity, the timing is the crucial part. And that is what we learn the central nervous system to react to this very, very short period of time. And what we've seen is as soon as we introduce people to this type of training, they'll start, increasing and decreasing the results. So we've got kids, for example, in China that had done nothing for 3-4 years. You get them into the system, it takes 6-9 months, and all of a sudden they're jumping and running very, very fast, because now their central nervous system is able to do things. And also part of that is their central nervous system, and which is primary, it's got to recover. And that's one of the big mistakes that a lot of people do, is there's too much grinding. It doesn't have enough time to recover.
So for people listening right now too, to clarify, one of the reasons why Rolf will switch from peak velocity to time to peak velocity is because when you're measuring a range of motion that's very, very short, the peak velocity, it actually decreases because you need distance in order to travel a certain speed. But if you're only traveling a specific distance, like let's say a quarter squat, then all you're trying to measure is how fast you get to the maximum velocity of that little movement. So if you're doing a quarter squat, you might only be squatting like 1.2 meters per second, or if you're doing the box squat, that high box squat, what meters per second will you guys end up moving at?
Oh, yeah, it's around about there, 1.2, 1.3.
But the
it's
time
not very
to
fast at all.
But the time.
What if someone's slower than that? What do you do with that individual?
Decrease the weight. But what usually happens
So what's a better stimulus to the body then? If that person can move the speed you want them to move with lower weight?
No, for example, my sprinter now, for example, Jacob, what he did a test yesterday, and he moved 90 kilos faster than he did about a month and a half ago. Then he moved 80 kilos in a hang clean. So he's moving up. He moved 90 kilos, 200 pounds at 2.6 meters per second. So he's moving. So that's the whole thing. We want to move more weight faster. That is the whole essence. That it is the only way for us to get any transfer from what we're doing in the gym to the track.
And is that all year long, Rolf, that you're always focused on speed, or is there certain times in the year where the focus is actually more on weight?
No, there is a like I said, you can't discard the force side of the equation. So in the early part of the year, when we get out of the GP, which is usually just to get everything sorted out and just balance out things, we always start with a max, what we call a max strength phase, where we try to lift as much as we can, and we stay within certain parameters. But at the same time, we do a lot of acceleration work, because that type of lifting and acceleration, they go hand in hand. But once we start introducing max velocity, and for us, we don't run anything under 90%. If we're doing anything under 90%, it's just extensive tempo. So we accelerate, and then once we start doing track work for max velocity, we start at 90%. So that means we go 90, 92, 94, 96, 98%, for example. And then once we get into that.
Are there any parameters in which you say we can't move on to the meters per second, the measuring velocities? At what point do you say we're good enough, or are we not good enough? Because you say the force side matters. When do you establish that the force actually matters?
Well, I mean, we've learned through the years that what usually happens is, if you've seen the video of Sue with 200 kilos on the Kaiser squat, and the guy weighs 70 kilos, so he's getting close to triple body weight. And I mean, you've seen the video; it's just like bang, 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 bang. It's crazy fast. It is. I mean, that's just pure unadulterated power. I mean, the guy weighs 70 kilos and he's moving 440 pounds like it's just not there. So we know that for a sprinter, you need to be able to sort of get to, if you can't sort of move 1.5, 1.8 times your body weight real fast, then you're not strong enough. Usually what happens and what we've found is that with this type of training, a lot of people think, oh, okay, you don't get strong. But we never try to lift for the sake of getting stronger. We lift heavier weights, but we try to move them always with the intent of moving them fast. And as a result, we get very strong. So none of our sprinters are by any stretch of the imagination. They're not weak. I mean, you know, these guys don't look very much, but they'll clean 130 kilos and they're moving that at 2 meters per second, which is not that ain't too shabby if you're a little guy weighing 70 kilos.
Will, what do you think?
I'm still trying to understand why you place so much value in these metrics.
Simply because
time to peak velocity, in these, like, because these are weight room exercises, correct?
Yeah.
Like, so which metrics do you think provide the most potent stimulus to the body? Like, if you have a high number on a certain metric, which one provides the most potent stimulus to the body that's going to actually elicit the adaptation you're looking for? And I'm talking about a global adaptation, something that touches the nervous system, something that touches like the architectural type of the tissues. You know what I mean?
Well, it's without a doubt the acceleration and the peak velocity, time to peak velocity, time to peak power.
Okay, so time to peak velocity. What should that time to peak velocity be in order for you to be confident that you are using the correct load and you're achieving the desired adaptation that you want?
It all depends on the event, because the event dictates the time to peak velocity.
You're talking about the event, like when you say event, are you talking about the exercise, or are you talking about the event that the sprinter performs?
Yeah. In this case,
so let's take a 100 meter sprinter. What exercise? Okay, you got an exercise you want to use for a 100 meter sprinter. What exercise are you looking at, and what is the time to peak velocity that you think is the appropriate time to peak velocity to achieve the desired adaptation?
It depends on which exercise, because squats are different. Squats are,
right.
For example,
so let's say squats
progression.
Yeah.
So squats are we start, and then we progress with squats from deep squats to quarter squats to box squats. And then we start with step ups, and the step up goes from 12 inches to 8 inches to 4 inches. Now, a 4-inch box allows these guys to get with about, let's see, what we're probably using about 150, 160 kilos, which is about double body weight for some of these guys. And that we are moving at very close to about 100 milliseconds is the time to peak velocity. So we're getting fairly close, but we're never going to get as fast as we are on the track. But with the exercises, then what we do on the track, with using, for example, the 1080 sprint, where we get assisted bounding, assisted sprints, where we're looking at this, hitting this neural barrier when it comes to repositioning, and that is what dictates how fast you can run. It's not just fiber composition; it's also your elasticity. Because we've had guys that have got massively good genetics, but they simply can't reposition. So there is a component there if they haven't done the right type of training, which means that we use Olympic lifting. We use that in the long-term athletic development, because also we need to be able to get them to become good athletes, good movers. So we talk about, for example, in long-term athletic development, we talk about 9 movement patterns. You've got to be able to jump, land, rotate, hinge, lunge, and push, pull, for example. Now, out of those 9 movement patterns, everything that we do virtually in sports, you can find an exercise that incorporates that. And what we've found is with athletes, which is very, very evident when you come to China and work, because there they pick out kids and they become long jumpers or triple jumpers or whatever at the age of 12 or 13, maybe a little bit later, but not much. And they have very, very good movement patterns in 2, maybe 3 of these 9 movement patterns. Then when they come up and start working, the problem is we can't load them because they can't do a lot of the exercises. Like we've had guys who've come to us in the national team who can't lift, they can't jump, they can't bound. What do you do with a 10-20 sprinter that can't do anything of these things, and who's 25 years old? So you've got to re-educate him, and you're not going to do very much with stimulus with somebody who's genetically gifted enough that he can virtually run 10-20 without much training from the gym. But we need to get him stronger, but we also need to keep him healthy. So it's a balance. So these exercises are very, very important in the aspect of long-term athletic development. And when, for example, Randy did a podcast a few months ago and it started a real outcry on social media because he said, no, we don't use Olympic lifting. Because Olympic lifting, the way it works as far as the power outputs and the timing and everything, we've got help for about 4 steps. Randy says 2, I say 4. The first 4 steps, if I just think about getting somebody as strong and as powerful as possible using Olympic lifting, I can do that, no problem. But the problem is these guys are picking up velocity so quickly. By the time they get out to about 6-7 steps, they're already moving at 8 meters per second. And then all the training that these guys normally would do as weightlifters, it's over and done with. You just simply cannot reposition fast enough and exert the amount of force in the time frames that the feet are now subjected to, because it's picking up like 180, 120, 130, 115, 100, 90, 85, 80 milliseconds in ground contact time. And they just simply haven't done that. And nothing happens.
So Will, one of the reasons why, and I lean more towards the Randy side, and we're talking about Randy Huntington. That was Sue's track coach. Whenever he says Randy, I lean more towards Randy's side than I do Rolf's side in regards to the transfer of Olympic lifts, or any weight room exercise per se into the first 2 steps. And the reason that my personal premise on that is simply based off of meters per second in which the limb moves. First step is like 1.8 meters per second. Second step, Rolf, what's second step? Like 2.4 or 2.6 or like maybe even 3 meters per second, right? And then by the third step, you're moving like 4 meters per second, 3.5 meters.
And you're talking about the limb moving about the hip.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like that. What's extension, right? Like that's and it's based off of a lot of it's based off of 1080 technology, how that's measured, right? So the first step, 1.8 meters per second. The second step bumps up to whatever it does. So for me, if we're not moving the weight in the weight room that fast, we're not influencing the acceleration past that point from a time to peak velocity standpoint or from a peak velocity standpoint. So that's where they're getting the 2 to, and Randy thinks, Rolf thinks even for the first 4 steps. So like, you know how people say the Olympic lifters, like they got the best fucking 10s in the world. Maybe not. Maybe they have the best first 2 or 3 steps is essentially what it is. So talk to us. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah. Have you guys seen any of my stuff on dynamic correspondence?
No. So I'm sorry.
I think dynamic correspondence is fake.
Go on.
So I don't think you can replicate. I think it's misguided to try to replicate anything you do in the weight room that you would do in sport. So I'm not concerned with any of those metrics at all. I'm never concerned with the power output. I'm never concerned with rate of force development. I think all of that stuff just gets trained via a good training program. If you're sprinting, if you're bounding, if you're doing plyos, if you're lifting. So I have absolutely no concern with dynamic correspondence at all. So like I kind of just reject it outright.
Well,
I don't think you're going to be able to squeeze out any sort of any little bit of improvement in your sports performance doing anything in the weight room. That's why I was asking like why you care about certain metrics over just like the potency of a stimulus that's being placed on the organism that's going to drive a global adaptation. That you see what I'm coming from?
Yeah, but what is the global adaptation at what time frame? You've got to realize that you've got to react in. Not only do you have to the complete ground contact time for Sue, for example, is 74 milliseconds, but of those 74 milliseconds, it takes him about, we think, because this you can't measure at the moment. We're working with Hawkins Dynamics to do this, but we think that people like Sue and these guys who can run these extremely fast times, they are probably in the vicinity of 20, 30 milliseconds. That's how long it takes when they come in the V. In other words, their foot's coming into the ground and they start braking, they start loading that. Now, once they get past vertical and then start releasing to toe off, that takes to about 54 milliseconds. So 54 plus 20, there's your 74. Now, the difference between Sue and somebody who's running, let's say, 10-10, is that first part will take them 30 milliseconds. Now, all of a sudden, you've got 85 milliseconds instead of 74. You multiply that by roughly 45 steps, there's your time difference. So it becomes very, very crucial that they have a capacity to be able to load and unload the spring. Now, what happens and what we've seen is if we don't look at these metrics, they simply, in the what we call the amortization phase of loading the spring, they will. This is very, very evident when you look at long jumpers. So, for example, if you take a long jumper that's coming in at the board at 10 meters per second, and this happens all the time, our coach will say, okay, we're going to get this guy faster. And they get him faster. So he comes in at 10.7 meters per second, but he doesn't jump any further. And why? Very, very simple. Because now all of a sudden he's got 10.7 meters per second of speed, which means the inertial energy is much higher, which means if he's going to get on and off the board at 120 milliseconds like he did before, he's going to have to be able to generate more eccentric force faster. Otherwise, he's going to be on the board so longer. So what happens is he's increased his velocity horizontally to 10.7, but he'll slow down his board takeoff if he can't react on the board faster. So in other words, the eccentric capacity at velocity has to increase. If it doesn't, game over. And this is what happens time and time and time again. The kids, athletes, they get faster, but it doesn't correspond into jumping distance because they simply cannot utilize the speed at which they have on the board. So what happens then is the body is one of the most perfect mechanisms on this planet at adaptation, because it always wants to find the easy way out. It doesn't want to exert itself more than it needs. And it then feels, okay, I can't handle this. So I'm going to have to just use plasticity in everything that I've got and stay on that board a little bit longer. Now I can utilize this. And then all of a sudden, I'm on the board 140 millisecond, and all the speed that I added to this equation is gone.
So let me interrupt real quick. Will, understanding that, right? That anything, let's say there's that threshold for velocity coming into the jump, right? In which someone can have the ability to concentrically produce the force for a PR, right? So let's say if they run into the jump at 10 meters per second and they end up jumping nine meters, whatever the hell it is, right? They end up jumping 9 meters. But then if they go to 10.1 meters per second, they jump 8 meters, right? So like that threshold is that 10 meters per second. What? And obviously those are outrageous numbers, but I'm just saying that threshold. What, since you don't believe in dynamic correspondence, the principles of dynamic correspondence, what are you doing to train that athlete to prepare himself to withstand more eccentric force, more eccentric overload, rate of force development in order to overcome that, to jump even further?
Ooh, I don't really know if I have an answer to that. But if someone's like, can you repeat that scenario one more time?
Okay. There's a threshold in which you could come into the jump, right? If you come into the jump at 11 miles per hour, you jump your
And you're
PR.
talking about your center of mass.
Yeah, the velocity at which you take off, right? So like hitting that jump during that amortization phase while your foot hits the ground is 11 miles an hour. And you can PR. The second you go to 11.2 miles per hour, you collapse and you can't even overcome it. How are you training? So since you don't believe in dynamic correspondence, what we would do is we would do our best to mimic the forces and the speeds associated with that specific movement in positions similar to that to strengthen them. That's what, in our opinion, that's how and then we regress to more simplistic exercises and we try to build up to that exercise. And that's how we try to transfer our training into the actual application. So you don't believe in dynamic correspondence. What are you doing? Just clean. Hey, get more cleans. You know what I mean?
Essentially, essentially just trying to continue to become a more adaptable and robust athlete overall. So, okay, going to your scenario, there's this threshold, the threshold of how fast you can enter into a jump, right? Essentially, you surpass that threshold and now your performance decreases. Correct? So what is the exact quality or the exact metric that you would look to improve? That's my question. And I would be extremely, extremely skeptical of whatever the answer would be, because like human performance is all based on interdependent variables working together, right? So when one variable changes, you have to assume all of these other variables are going to change too. You know what I mean? So that's why I would be extremely skeptical if someone were to give me a metric that they're going to improve via training that's not going to potentially have a negative influence on another metric within that same movement.
Sure. And my thought process is, no one here is saying for certain what the metric is. However, what we are currently thinking, right? Like, because you're constantly on the search, you know what I mean? Like, and we're getting closer. Randy, Rolf, how much closer are you now to understanding things than you were 10 years ago, than you were 20 years ago, than you were 30 years ago? Like, do you think you have are you starting to refine the scope based on trial and error of new and different ideas?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you look at, what we do today, the striking thing, if you look at what, for example, the guys that are doing the performances today, what is evident is that things are being done faster. The volumes have decreased, but intensities over a long period of time. In other words, this notion that, for example, that was around and it's still prevalent in many places when it comes to periodization, that you have these blocks. So you GP, then you do your max strength, and then you do your transfer, your specific strength, and then you start running fast. That's how, in my days when I was an athlete, that's what we did. But the problem is then that all of a sudden I'm going to be running fast, right? Like 6 weeks before I'm going to start competing. No wonder we were getting operated left, right, and center, because there's no adaptation anywhere along those lines. There's just too big a difference of what the qualities. So I'm boxing one quality in here, and then, okay, I'm transferring, but it's just not, there's no adaptation. So what we've seen is, if you're going to run fast without chemicals, and that is what we do, you've got to have a stimulus of running fast and subjecting the organism to velocities both eccentrically and concentrically on a yearly basis. You don't sort of drop speed training 6 months of the year and just get strong and think, okay, I'm going to run fast. You can get away with that when you at certain time periods in your development, which is very typical of a lot of kids who sort of start training seriously at 17, They get to 21, 22, it's all hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden everything just stops. Nothing happens. And then 2-3 years go by and they're virtually plateauing and even regressing. Then Randy and I step in, we get these kids, we put them into our program, and then within 9-12 months, these guys start firing on all cylinders. And then all of a sudden you can see what happens to their power outputs, their velocity outputs, everything just goes off the chart compared to what they've been doing before. Because now all of a sudden the organism is getting a chance to recover. And that is probably one of the biggest things. Is you can do any training in the world. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do. If you can't recover, and recover doesn't mean that I can do something crazy stupid on Monday and recover by Wednesday. We're talking about, as you know, I work 2 weeks accumulation, 1 week recovery, 2 weeks intensification, 1 week recovery. So a block for me is 6 weeks. Same with Randy. He works 3-1, 3-1. And if you can't do 6 weeks of training and get through that and have a positive outcomes, in other words, about midway through the 6 week, which is recovery, you will get super compensation and all your parameters are then peaking. And then we start a new cycle, which depending on where we are in the year, will have a little bit of a different scope to it. It doesn't matter, because if you can't recover, it's all over. It's that's it, finished. Go home.
Are there any examples in the sprinting history where guys weren't doing much weight room stuff at all? Like, wasn't Carl, is it true that Carl Lewis also didn't do any weights or something like that? And then what was also the end of his career? What stopped him from progressing? I don't know too much about the history.
Well, I mean, Carl did a lot of jumping, so he was getting a lot of stimulus from his jumping, which is very unusual for a sprinter to do that type of jumping, because he was a prolific long jumper as well. So Carl he's a different kettle of fish because of the fact that he was a jumper. But if you look at sprinters that are, predominantly they are only sprinters and they've run very, very fast, there's always exceptions to the rule. And the thing is that we don't really know, because there was no technology and we couldn't measure the things that we measure today at that time point. So it would have been very, very interesting to find out what made those guys tick. Because, I mean, we're not saying we've got all the answers. We can say that we've got a system of working today that when we put people in, people start running faster. I mean, Jacob, for example.
And to be fair, Rolf, you guys coached, in my opinion, like the fastest person on the planet in history. You know what I mean? So like, that's the other thing, Will, like they did it with a guy who was over the hill. Like Sue was technically sprinters peak at what, like 28, 29 years old. And he PR'd his 60, a world record 60 at 31.
32.
They're at 32, So like, I at some point, like I totally get your skepticism. I'm skeptic as fuck. But at some point, like, man, maybe these guys are fucking on to something. Do you understand what I'm saying? And what do you tell me what you think? Push back. I want to fucking hear it.
All right. So here's one question. So with the metrics, Rolf, that you've identified as the most important metrics, which would be, correct me if I'm wrong, just say yes or no, the two top metrics you care about in training is peak velocity and time to peak velocity?
Yeah.
Okay, so why are those two metrics more important than any other metric that you could pull out? Impulse, force, acceleration gradient, starting gradient, any of these things. Like if you were to prioritize any of those other metrics in your training, what would the negative consequence of your training be compared to what you're doing with the peak velocity and time to peak velocity?
Well, what we see is that if we look at those two and focus on those, then there are some other metrics that we still capture, of course, but we don't sort of pay a lot of attention. It's not sort of our key go-to metrics. But we will see, for example, like we look at watts per kilo body weight eccentrically. and concentrically. Those numbers will go up, for example. And this is very, very evident when you, for example...
Do they also improve when your athletes are on the track sprinting? Do you measure that with the 1080?
No, you don't. No, in with the 1080, you're measuring force and power and velocity, and we use what do you call it, optojump, to measure ground contact times and a few of the other metrics. With the 1080, it can do a lot of things, but and it's all depending on what the manufacturer wants to do with the software. At the moment, that's what they give us, and it's plenty. But I mean, we capture, for example, 37 metrics with. I use a system called Muscle Lab. I have since 1997 when it came out, and it goes straight into Excel. So I've got, I think it's 37 metrics that we capture now. So we've started looking at impulse, and in certain events you want impulse, in certain events you don't want impulse. So
my gut feeling is impulse would be the most important one. That's my gut feeling.
Well, both yes and no. It depends a little bit on the event. But what the thing we were talking,
I'm talking for sprinters. For sprinters,
yeah.
Can we clarify what impulse is for people listening?
Yeah, Rolf, do you want to, or you want me to?
No, you shoot away. I'm going to see if I can find one of my Muscle Lab testing protocols.
Yeah, impulse would just be like the amount of force, the highest force that's produced within like a certain time frame. I guess is like the easiest, most simple way to define it. Mike, you have your own kind of definition for it?
Well, we have which impulse are we referring to, right? Like the takeoff impulse or a landing impulse?
True.
You know what I mean? So like it's
right.
Everything, and that's, listen, these are, we're trying to capture, I think what the goal is to capture the lowest hanging fruit at the moment, right? Is there a specific metric that's going to be better? Yeah, let's work in 5 years, and as soon as the technology finds something a little bit better, like, yeah, sure. But at this moment, shit, these guys are getting good fucking results doing that. You know what I mean? And the velocity component of things, I think is substantially more important than the force component of things once you get to a certain point. You know what I mean? Like, it's like once you get strong enough, like what's strong enough? And then after that, like, bro, who gives a fuck what you're doing in the weight room? Like, let's just move shit fast.
I pretty much agree with that, which is kind of why I reject the dynamic correspondence argument. If it doesn't really matter what you're doing in the weight room, I don't think you need to try to get super specific, trying to replicate various things from your sport performance.
So have you
so
read...
we agree with the premise that once you're strong enough, it doesn't really matter what you do, right?
To an extent, like from a general standpoint, but it's like strong enough from I guess from simply the force side of the equation. Then it's how fast can you move that weight, right? Then it's just the speed, which will increase. That'll increase the power. But you know what I mean? It won't necessarily increase the force. But I mean, if you get the acceleration up, it will increase the force.
Let me jump in quick on that. Yeah, it'll increase the power production, but the power that's produced is always going to be specific to the context in which you're in. So like, just because you improve your ability to produce power in one context, and we'll even use the context that I like to use, which would be an Olympic lift. In no way can you be confident that improving your ability to produce power in the Olympic lift is going to carry over to the ability to produce power when you're sprinting or jumping or doing anything else, That makes sense there?
So, yes, but my argument to that, I think, is that the Olympic lift is such a general movement. Whereas if you get more specific, right? So let's take, have you read Transfer of Training by Bondarchuk?
A long time ago. That was part of my graduate program, like mandatory reading. So I've read bits and pieces of it. I have not read it.
Okay, so
and by the way, I would probably, but some people probably have, but I would be, I'd probably call most people liars if they said they've read that cover to cover.
oh,
You know
dude, I have. It's
Have you?
yeah. I've read both of them, volume 1 and volume 2 or whatever the fuck. I got them right over here. Those were part of my Adderall days. So if you look at the way that let's say how he compared the throws, right, with the shot put throwers early on, it was all general work. And granted, his stats are probably wrong. You know what I mean? Like there's take it all with a grain of salt, but it's still something interesting. Early on, the general stuff improved performance the most. And as you got more elite, the specific stuff is what improved performance the most. So the 8 kilo shot and the 9 kilo shot, and then this is where the overweight underweight training has come from. Now, do you follow any baseball training at all? Okay, so like the velocity stuff, the weighted balls, right? That's very, very specific. Now, if you have a low-level thrower and you have him throw a 2-pound ball, he may have improvements. If you have a high-level thrower and you have him throw a 2-pound ball, he may get injured. The more specific, or the better the athlete is, or the better the more refined the movement is, the more closely related the movements need to be in order to transfer into performance. That's why baseball is 5.25 ounces. Like the best throwers, like the hardest throwers, like 6-ounce ball, maybe 7-ounce ball, like that'll improve performance. Whereas guys that don't throw as hard, like a 4-ounce ball, 3-ounce ball, or maybe even a heavier ball, something further away is what's going to improve performance. Does that make sense? Okay. So keeping that in mind, right? The rate of movement, the speed of movement, the direction of movement, it all gets closer and closer and closer as you get more and more elite in order to improve that performance. But as your general, you could be far away. Like, Charlie Francis always said, all intensity early on in GPP is medium intensity, which means like, bro, it don't mean fuck all what you do, because all you got to do is just something and you're going to get better. I think with the lower level, that's true. But as you get older, it just needs to get a little bit more specific. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would just disagree. I just reject that. Because you made a dynamic correspondence argument, right? Like the more proficient you get, the more confident you get in your sports performance, the more specific you need to be within your training to further increase your improvement in that sports performance, right? Mm-hmm. I just think, actually, in a way, let me think about this. Yeah, maybe in a way, the better you get at your sports, in a way, the less you need specific stuff, and just the more the general stuff is important, because then you're really, in a way, because Rolf even touched on this in the beginning, is that the actual number one priority of the training is to stay healthy, mm-hmm. right? And I feel like the general stuff is going to take care of that better than the specific stuff. You're going to get larger ranges of motion. You're going to get a wider variety of loads, a wider variety of velocities. All that kind of stuff is probably going to be more conducive to staying healthy than any sort of quote unquote specific work that you do. I don't know. That was my thoughts.
I'll give you another example. The world record was just beaten by a guy from Lithuania. And I've been sort of chatting with those guys for I don't know, maybe a year or so regarding their training, because they think that what traditionally is throws training is a lot of just getting big and strong. And they did a Dr. Ariel Gideon and Mac Wilkins. They got a film of the world record throw, and they were going through the biomechanics of it. And what really stands out with Miklos, what he does in his throw, is that when he gets his left side into the at the front of the ring and he starts to brace, he does that unbelievably quickly. So in other words, before his right arm can start unwinding in the throw, he's got his left side braced. And the quicker you can do that, the more force you can apply to your right arm because you've got ground contact. And then everything you lift off the ground. So what he's able to do is through velocity and being able to generate very, very quick eccentric forces, he can prolong the pull on the discus. And the guy is like the Swedes have got a guy who won the World Championships last year and he won the Olympics in 21. He's thrown 72 meters, and Daniel is 202 and 160 kilos. Miklos is 1.93 and 108 kilos. He does things which at 108 kilos is quite outstanding. For example, he's got a drop jump where he's in the ground 157 milliseconds, and then he does about a 70, I think it's close to a 70 vertical, which is at 108 kilos that's crazy. So you can clearly see then, and what Mac was commenting, and Mac was known for being very, very fast in the ring. He was a bit of a trendsetter. Mac was strong, but he was very fast. And even Mac, because I saw the video when Mac was commenting, and he said he couldn't believe how fast that he is working at the front of the ring, which gives him a lot more time to pull on the discus because of the fact that he's able to do what he does with his left side. So that is rate of force development, eccentric rate of force development that he's got, which is faster than anybody else. And the question is then, what is somebody like Daniel Stahl? What's his answer going to be now when there's a guy who can walk out and who weighs 108 kilos to his 160 and out throws him? Is he going to get stronger? Well, he's already doing triples at 300 kilos, 330 kilos in a sumo deadlift. He squats well over 300. He benches 220 or whatever he does. So anything that he does and gets stronger from there, he's actually going to get slower. Mm. So
even if he's still practicing his like specific sport.
Oh yeah,
you think so?
Yeah. Bondarchuk actually referenced that too. He said once his guys got over like a 500-pound bench, their throws went down.
Yeah. So if you look at Daniel, I mean, what he's been able to do, which is part of it also. But again, if you look at his PB, it's gone virtually nowhere in the last 4-5 years. And then you've got to ask yourself, why is it? Has he reached his plateau? I mean, the guy's 202. He's got a wingspan like a bloody, jumbo jet. It's unreal. It's like an albatross, and he weighs 160 kilos, and the damn thing weighs 2 kilos. I mean, you should be able to throw that thing, out of the stadium. You'd think so anyway. But they simply can't get enough velocity because they're simply not fast enough in the ring. And therefore, the discus catches up to them, and that then limits. It doesn't matter how much power or speed or strength you've got. If you shorten the time that you can pull on the discus, then it's game over. Because that's what we see again with people, for example, with squats. If people do a full squat and they get, let's say, 2,000 watts, and they go, yeah, and then I ask them to do a quarter squat, and they'll do 1,700 watts, and they'll go, yeah, well, see, that was no good. It's only 1,700 watts. And then I show them, okay, but have a look at your TPV. At the full squat, your TPV was 0.27, so 270 milliseconds. The TPV on your quarter squat was 180, 0.18. Okay, you've lost 300 watts, and you've lost a little bit of velocity because you've got a shorter range of motion to work on the bar. But the acceleration.
What if you shorten that range of motion even more?
What's that?
What if you shorten that range of motion even more? Instead of a quarter squat, it's like an eighth squat.
Yeah, and that's what his time is.
Time to peak velocity would do what?
Yeah.
would change
it gets
again.
faster. Yeah, it gets faster.
Right.
And therefore, neurally, that is what the body, that's what we're after. We want that neural adaptation to get us
So
quick.
why not just only move like half a centimeter?
They can't coordinate.
What about half an inch?
Yeah, which we've seen. So, for example, last year or the year before, whatever. My Australian sprinter. So we went down in box height in step ups, and we kept the same weight just to see what happens. And his TPV should get faster and faster. Once we got down to about 5.5, 6 inches, we had a lot of boxes that we tried this. He just stopped. He just could not go any lower because he simply couldn't coordinate.
Would limb length play a role into the distance you want to move that's optimal for coordination? Like if you got a 6'3" sprinter compared to a 5'11" sprinter, you can't really standardize the range of motion on a box squat or a step up.
Well, we tried where we do. And if we've got somebody, with very, very long femurs, for example, then we'll use different boxes to level things out. Because what we're after is getting into those positions that we know that's where they're going to be able to generate the highest amount of acceleration. And that will be different depending on your lower legs and your tibia and your fibia and so forth. Definitely. But I mean, the thing is that we've been doing this for so long now, and we can see that it doesn't matter who we throw into this equation. As soon as we start getting and working them this way, things start to happen, and they happen fast. And then when you go away from it, for example, I was in Hong Kong for 2 years. I got a kid there, and he went from 770, which he'd been doing for 3.5 years, no improvement. It took me 7-8 months. He was jumping over 8 meters. And then they decided, oh, this is boring training. Oh, really? Boring. You're jumping 8 meters. You've got a chance of making the Olympics. So I said, okay, fair enough. So I packed my bags and went home. Now, for 1 year, he's been doing the same shit he was doing before. Guess what? He's jumping 760. So what happened? He's gone back to grinding. He's gone back to doing the same thing. So his nervous system has now said, right, there's no need to adapt anymore. I don't need to do this because now the demands on me is back down here where I was the previous 4 years. So that's it. End of story. So he's virtually just taken his career, gone over to the crapper, crapped in it, and flushed it.
So on that note, Will's got to bounce. We gotta finish up. Will, do you have anything you want to finish with? Do you want to tell everyone where to follow you? What do you want to say?
Yeah. You can just look me up on Instagram or YouTube. Just search my name. You'll find me. Yeah, that's it. No, I appreciate this conversation, guys. I had fun. I enjoyed listening to a lot of different perspectives.
Thank you, buddy. Well, I've got one final question for you, mate.
Yeah.
In your work in the college, what is are you working with all the different Olympic teams, or is it more the football team?
You're asking like specifically for me, or are you just trying to get a sense of like generally?
No, for you.
Me. Okay. Yeah. So the school I work at, we have like one director of strength and conditioning. So he's like in charge of the entire department. He works with football only. And then he has a staff below him. So there's 3 assistants underneath him. So I'm one of the assistants. So I get assigned other teams. So I work with the volleyball team and the softball team. So I'm like head of strength and conditioning for those teams. And then we all assist with football. So I work with 3 teams. I'm in charge of 2 of them, and I assist with 1 of them. That's basically what I do. So with football, I don't make any sort of programming decisions. I kind of just show up to their training sessions. And then when I show up, I'm told who I'm working with, what racks to go do, what the objective is for that session, that kind of thing. But with the volleyball and softball, I'm like in charge of programming, training, execution, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Lovely.
All right, boys.
Thank you, buddy.
Will, you get the fuck off. Thank you so much, bro. We appreciate
Thanks,
you.
guys. I appreciate it.
Buddy. Nice to meet you.